Before you go out and start building your own gaming PC, or even just go buy an Alienware R11 or R12 or whatever they're on at this point, there's a couple things that you should keep in mind just so you know what's good, instead of just having all the terms being like, oh, it's an i7, so that's automatically better than an i3. That's not really how PC parts work, and this video is just going to explain what to actually look out for if you're going to build a gaming PC yourself, or even just buy a pre-built. Firstly, let's start off by talking about the CPU. So there are two main CPU companies, AMD and Intel. Now, if it's an AMD CPU, you want to make sure it's a Ryzen series CPU and not an FX series, because the FX series is just really old and Intel was better then. In the current time, Ryzen is better for price to performance in most cases, and also just in general if you want to do anything other than game on your PC. So I would say go for a Ryzen processor and you'll be fine. But if you are on a budget or you just really want to go Intel, go for 10th gen Intel. And if you're going to go very budget, I wouldn't go lower than like 4th or 5th gen Intel. But even then, a newer 10th gen i3 would be better than a really old i7 or a really old i5. Just because it's an i3 doesn't mean it's bad, and just because it's an i7 doesn't mean it's good. What you really want to be looking at with a CPU is the number of cores and the number of threads. For gaming nowadays, you pretty much need 4 cores, and 4 threads would be great, but if you get something that has more than 4 threads, that would be ideal. So something like a processor with 4 threads and 2 cores would be terrible. That's like what my laptop back there has. You want something with at least 4 cores and I'd say 8 threads, so double the number of cores as your threads. I personally have an overkill 8 core 16 thread processor, but honestly 4 cores and 8 threads on any processor should be good. Next, let's talk about the motherboard. So the motherboard, the main thing is to make sure that it works with your CPU. With AMD it's pretty simple. The AM4 Ryzen processors all pretty much have the same motherboard. All you need to make sure is that the BIOS is compatible with your generation of CPU. And they're split up into the 50s, 70s, and 10s, or 20s, I can't remember. But in general, a B450 or B550 motherboard is your best bet if you're very new to PC building. And if you're higher up, I would say get X570 motherboard or something, but like, why are you watching this video if you already know that? On the Intel side, just make sure that it works, because Intel likes to change their sockets every couple of years. A great way to tell if your CPU and motherboard are compatible is by going to pcpartpicker.com and just putting in your CPU and putting in a motherboard and seeing whether they're compatible. Once you have a CPU picked out and then a compatible motherboard, you should probably get RAM sorted. So depending on how many slots your motherboard has, you should probably opt for dual channel memory, which basically means instead of getting one stick of 8 GB, get 2 sticks of 4, or instead of one stick of 16, get 2 sticks of 18. Once you have RAM, there's a couple of things you need to look out for RAM. Make sure that your CPU can actually handle the faster RAM speeds if you're going to pay for faster RAM, because there's no point of buying a 3200 MHz set of RAM if your CPU isn't going to allow that. So make sure that your CPU can actually handle the RAM. If you're going older parts and you're on a budget, it's most likely going to be DDR3, but if you're going to build with new parts, it's going to be DDR4 memory. Just make sure you're buying the right generation of RAM before you buy. And then with RAM, it's really just about speed and then cost latency. But being completely honest, if you're a beginner, just make sure it's around 3000 megahertz for most Ryzen CPUs, and Intel doesn't really take advantage of the faster RAM speed, so you could save some money there. But I'd say around 3000 is a good starting point if you're just building your first PC without any other knowledge. So for RAM, just make sure it's dual channel, it works with your generation of motherboard, and it's at least like 3000 megahertz if it's DDR4. If it's DDR3, don't worry about the 3000 megahertz thing, just buy whatever works. Now for GPU, it's a little more complicated, but generally, if the number is bigger... Right, so at this point in the video, the microphone stopped recording, so I'm switching to inbuilt microphone on the camera, so the audio quality is going to go down a little bit. But hey, if you watched this far in the video, consider subscribing to the YouTube channel. I'm trying to get to 100,000 toward the end of this year. Okay, thank you, bye now. That is better. So a 1050 would be worse than a 1060, for example. But you also want to look at the other stuff. So the 1060 is older, whereas the 2060 would be newer, and then the 3060 is a myth. It's not really a myth, it's a real card. You just can't buy anywhere because GPU shortage and silicon shortage, and the GPU market is terrible right now. In all honesty, you'd be lucky to get a good GPU. But if you know nothing, I say don't go lower than a 1650. There's actually a website that lists GPUs in terms of their power and puts them in layman's terms if you don't understand too much about CUDA cores and all that stuff. I'd say go there if you have no clue what to do with a GPU, but once again, buying a GPU right now is very difficult to do, so say you're lucky if you even get one at recommended retail price, but besides that, just make sure it works. Don't go below a 1650 and use this chart that will help you figure out what's best for your needs. Now, storage. You want an SSD, and unless you're going budget, the SSD is going to be very tiny and it's going to be an M.2 form factor, and you want to make sure it's M.2 NVMe. Don't worry about what that means. All that means is it's faster than SATA SSDs, and even though it's not beneficial for gaming right now, in the future it might be. So you might as well spend like an extra 10 to 15 pounds of dollars and get an NVMe M.2 SSD that works on your motherboard. Make sure it works on your motherboard. PC Part Picker, once again, will tell you if it doesn't, and then just make sure it's got enough capacity to hold Windows and then a couple other apps. And then I just get like a bigger hard drive for your games and just mass storage. Personally, I have a 1TB SSD which holds all the important applications and all the like core stuff on my PC, and then a 4TB hard drive to like hold all the mass storage such as my games and my videos and all that stuff. Now, power supply. Power supplies are also not very easy to find right now, but what you want to do to figure out how many watts you need on your power supply is go over to an online power supply calculator like this one here, type in all the things that you will be using the PC for, all the parts that you've picked out, and it will tell you roughly how many watts you should get for your power supply. And once you have that, the last thing you need is a case. Now, the case really doesn't matter. Some people don't buy a case. You could actually just buy like a £20 case as long as it fits the size of your motherboard and all the other components, but I'd say if you're gonna build your own PC and spend money on it, you might as well get a case that looks decent. It doesn't have to be amazing or anything, but as long as it's got a side panel maybe, let some RGB shine through, that's enough, right? And you can still get them on a budget for around 30 to 50 pounds. So the case doesn't really matter specs wise, just make sure it has a couple of USB ports, looks fairly okay, and you're happy with it. I mean, if you don't care about looks at all, you can honestly just get like an old case that's completely just solid opaque sides and back, but hey, it's preference, right? Do whatever you want. Just remember, CPU, look at cores and threads. GPU is incredibly hard to buy, but don't go below a 1650. RAM, make sure it's the right generation of RAM, and if it's DDR4, get at least 3000 megahertz. Storage, get an NVMe SSD if you can, and then put everything else on a big hard drive. Power supply, use a PSU calculator to get how many watts you need. And I think, oh, I almost forgot, make sure your motherboard and CPU are compatible. You don't want to be messing that up. That's like one of the most important things if you're going to build your own PC. Even if you're not going to build your own PC, I hope you understand things a little bit better now, because there's a lot of cheap PCs on eBay that claim to have an i7, and that's like the best thing, even though they have probably a 10 or 9-year-old first gen i7, which is terrible nowadays, but people are very easily tricked by the i7 compared to an i3, which is not really how anything works. Just make sure you look at the number of cores, the number of threads, and yeah. Also, if you're building your own PC, check if the cooler comes with stock thermal paste, because if you're buying used, the cooler might not come with thermal paste and you will have to buy your own thermal paste. And I'd say just go with some Arctic MX4. If it doesn't come with any thermal paste, it's like £6 or £7 and it's pretty good thermal paste for the price. That's been pretty much everything. So before you build your PC, take all these things into consideration and have fun building, and tell me if you get a GPU, because those are really hard to find right now. Okay, thanks for watching. Until next time, drink some water, stay hydrated, and I will talk to you later.